Good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to see you all here, especially spread around the room. I am really pleased to be here to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Gabriela Spears-Rico. I'm Catherine Squires. I'm the director of the RIGS Initiative. And it's just been such an interesting spring term, seeing people almost every week to hear from all these amazing scholars that we've been able to bring in. So thank you for those who have been multiple participants. And let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Spears-Rico. She earned her PhD and her MA in Comparative Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to that, she earned her bachelor's degree in Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity and Political Science with honors at Stanford University. Her work uses performance theory as a lens to examine the contested terrain of representation and the dynamics of cultural appropriation within mestizo and indigenous relations in Mexico. She is a scholar and a poet, or I could say a poet and a scholar. She has toured with Insight's Sister Fire Cultural Arts Tour for Women of Color, and her poetry has been anthologized in Mexico, Spain, and the United States. She is currently working on her first book, which explores how gendered violence has framed the racialization of indigenous people and manufactures mestizo identity in Mexico. In addition to her book in progress and her poetry, Dr. Spears-Rico has won numerous fellowships, including the SSRC Mellon Mays Dissertation Completion Grant and the Arnold L. Mitchum Dissertation Fellowship from Marquette University, where she also taught really interesting courses that speak to my heart, such as race and representation in Hollywood, Oscar's so white, and contemporary Native American thought, community, and culture. So we're thrilled to have her here today to present her talk, Consuming the Native Other, Mestiz Melancholia, and the Performance of Indigeneity in Michoacán. Please help me welcome Dr. Spears-Rico.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here. The title of my talk is Consuming the Native Other, Mestiz Melancholia, and the Performance of Indigeneity in Michoacán. And I want to tell you a little bit about how I began my field work. So I have roots in a Purépecha and a Matlatzinca community in my home state of Michoacán. I immigrated to the United States with my mom when I was 5 years old, and lived in migrant farm worker labor camps and up and down the American West Coast. But we also always maintained, our connections to our home communities. So with these roots and these particular communities, it was important for me, as I pursued my graduate work, that my work meant something to them as well. And I turned to Orgullo Purépecha, which is a migrant network of Purépecha migrants in the United States, for advice on what kind of work would be empowering to the community. What were the issues that were most prevalent, to them, because originally a lot of my work in my early graduate career focused more on issues of representation, issues of analyzing Chicano cultural production, for example, and they kind of geared me towards looking at tourism, because tourism is huge in our home state, and it has a huge impact on our indigenous communities. And so that's how I, approached the field work. I conducted semi-structured open-ended interviews with Purépecha locals and mestizo tourists during the Days of the Dead in Pátzcuaro and the surrounding communities and the island of Janitzio. And I also conducted in-depth participant observation at public observances and private ceremonies that my partner, who was also my fieldwork assistant, and I were invited to. And I also journaled about these experiences, and I took some photographs and some video footage as well when it was appropriate. This is my field site. I don't know how to point with this, but there in the map of Mexico, you can see that Michoacán is in the west central coast towards the bottom there. And in the map of Michoacán, Pátzcuaro is about an hour away from the capital city of Morelia. So that's what we're dealing with in terms of where exactly I worked. And this is a map of the Pátzcuaro Basin, and the island of Janitzio is right there, right in the middle, right by Tecuena, and that is where we get the most traffic in terms of tourists during the Days of the Dead in Michoacán every year. So who are Purépechas? We're the group that is commonly termed Tarasco Indians, if you read some earlier anthropological works about us, but we call ourselves Purépechas. The name Tarasco is actually erroneous. The Spaniards gave it to us, and it translates in our language into brother-in-law, but that's not what we call ourselves. We call ourselves Purépechas. The indigenous group that is in West Central Mexico, we were the second largest Mesoamerican society, which not a lot of people know, during pre-colonial times, known for our step pyramids, which we call yacatas, and also for resisting the Aztecs. Between 1460 and 1520, we actually engaged with warfare with the Aztecs continuously and became the only nation that successfully resisted Aztec territorial expansion into our territory. So that's something that Purépechas continue to be very proud of. And according to the 2005 Mexican census, currently there are approximately 105,000 Purépecha language speakers in Mexico, and most of them reside in Michoacán, Jalisco, Baja California, and Estado de Mexico, particularly in my home state of Michoacán, where we have a lot of language preservation resources as well. Why did I want to study the Days of the Dead? Well, as I mentioned before, these are the days that get the most tourist traffic in my home state. According to the Mexican Secretary of Tourism, 130 million people visited Michoacán during the Days of the Dead last year and spent more than 160 million pesos. So, that's a great deal just during those 3 days that happens in this region, specifically in the Pátzcuaro area. Maybe you've heard of the Days of the Dead before, when through representations or celebrations of the Days of the Dead here in the United States, it's become a very commodified holiday. It is a Mexican American observation, Chicano observation. Other Latinos also with origins in other Latin American countries may also have similar practices, and it is paired usually with the Catholic All Souls Day. However, for me, it was more important to understand how pre-Columbian beliefs influenced the Days of the Dead, because when I talked to Purépechas in the field, they told me that it was a practice that we had since time immemorial, since way before the arrival of the Spanish on Purépecha territory. So, for example, in their article, Mexica and Purépecha Funerary Practices, Mexican anthropologist Luis Fernando Núñez Enríquez and historian Roberto Martínez González from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, they analyzed evidence found both in La Relación de Michoacán being sort of like our codex, our written history that was related to Spanish friars, and then pictures were created and an oral history was recorded in La Relación de Michoacán. So these scholars have analyzed evidence in that document, as well as archaeological evidence in Purépecha graves that demonstrate that Purépechas buried our dead with common objects and food, and that we built altars for them. And this is important to note, because the reason why Purépechas were engaging in these practices that are similar to the Days of the Dead today is because we believe that the afterlife was a continuance of life on earth. And so if tools were put out for a person that they were working with, in their daily lives, if their favorite foods were put out, etc., it was because they were going to continue with that, with the same types of daily activities, the same kind of work was being carried out in the afterlife. So those are also roots of observations during the Days of the Dead that maybe you didn't know about before. My research questions as I approached the field work. I wanted to know, how does the phenomenon of playing Indian via Philip Deloria's work in his book called Playing Indian, or Going Native, manifest itself in Mexico? Why do mestizos tour the Purépecha Days of the Dead? How do Purépechas view mestizo tourists? Are Purépecha performers complicit participants in tourism, or do they challenge the appropriation of their traditions and spirituality? How do Purépechas preserve intimacy with their dead in light of very public displays of their mourning that happen during these days? How does this all inform understandings of race and ethnicity in Mexico? How is indigeneity constructed and performed in Mexico? And in turn, how is mestizaje constructed and performed in Mexico? some of the theory that I used to frame my work, I definitely looked at tourism theory. Tourism has become a means for the First World to explore indigenous people throughout the world. I looked at the work of Dean McCannell in the tourist papers, which he was one of the most innovative scholars looking critically at tourism and earlier anthropology. And he argues in the tourist paper that the same kind of argument actually that Philip Deloria poses in Going Native, that during late capitalist times like we're experiencing today, we become engulfed in anxiety because we don't have the direct relationships that we used to have before with each other. Excuse me. We become cogs in the machine. All we do is work, work and work. And those of us who have the leisure, the money, the time, the resources to travel, want to experience how people, still connect to each other in settings where maybe there's more communalism involved in their relationships, more kinship relationships. And that it is this leisure, this privilege of having the leisure to experience that, motivates us to have these touristic experiences and take vacations and sightsee, etc. I also looked at heritage tourism as a subfield of tourism studies, and specifically I wanted to understand how and why indigenous people curate the past for tourists to give them an experience of the past, and if they have any agency in this process of curating the past for tourists. The work of Walter E. Little and Alexis Bunton were specifically informative because they are definitely looking as indigenous people as agents and curators of their own culture as it is presented to tourists. And as Kathy mentioned, and when she introduced me, I also definitely looked at performance theory because it provides a critical lens for analyzing tourist-native interactions, because performance theory recognized the inherent power relations in the transmittal and construction of identities. So for example, somebody like Judith Butler, who looks at how acts that are repeated acts actually lead to the construction of gender as a subaltern identity. And I specifically, within performance theory, I looked at the performance of post-colonial racialized identities and their embodiment of cultural memory. And here, as I've been mentioning, the work of Philip Deloria, where he analyzes how and why white people continuously throughout U.S. history have appropriated Native identities to reproduce a notion of the nation state and a historical amnesia behind the genocide that happened to produce the United States, continuously throughout United States history. That's a way that these racialized identities are being performed and informing our cultural memory or cultural amnesia as a country. And finally, I also looked at scholars like James C. Scott, who looked specifically at resistance within performance, and his work on whether there is a hidden transcript, performances and acts that happen outside of the public realm that are resisting, for example, in this case, tourism, where it was important to me as I considered whether Purépechas, in my field site, were also performing in the hidden transcript and what their hidden transcript was telling us and what it looked like. One of the findings that I had in conversation with Renato Rosaldo and his theory of the experience of imperialist nostalgia, that he claims that scholars, particularly anthropologists, go into the field and experience nostalgia and mourn that things are not the way that they used to be before colonization, before the destruction ensued, and then feel guilty about that and romanticize the way that things used to be, but without really admitting their own complicity in that process or their own contribution to how that destruction happened. So Renato's actually on my committee, And he was on my committee, and he really informed how I understood these interactions by terming them an experience of Mestiz Melancholia as mestizos toured these indigenous communities during the Days of the Dead. And I claim that this melancholia originates from the unhealed wound, the unhealed rupture caused by the conquest, and that it yearns to resolve the great violence that took place in that moment of rape that birthed mestizaje. So what I'm claiming here is that mestizos are touring these indigenous communities to understand that great moment of violence and turning to indigenous people to possibly have the answers and what that healing could entail. I also found that indigenous bodies were being seen as surrogates of their pre-colonial ancestors. Why are indigenous people so important to defining the Mexican past for mestizos and for Mexican society at large? And I claim that that is because they function as surrogates. There's a process of surrogation. And surrogation in performance studies is the implied absence that is always existence within a performance. And here I'm looking at the work of Joseph Roach in Cities of Dead, where he claims that an absence is always present in performances. And if we look at the Americas as a post-colonial setting where great violence ensued, not only through the genocide of indigenous peoples, but through the enslavement of Africans, then we can understand, how that there was great violence and that violence is performative, and that today when racialized bodies perform, for example, the performance that was taking place in my field work, that racialized embodiment is a continuous embodiment of historical trauma. That violence didn't stay in the past more than 500 years ago when the rape happened, when the enslavement happened. That it's something that continues to be embodied and that it happens through performance. For Ruth Hellier Tinoco, who also actually did field work in the Pátzcuaro Basin with Purépechas around tourism, she claims that Purépecha bodies serve as the ultimate signifiers of indigenous authenticity for tourists in Michoacán, and I agree with her. This is what she states. The bodies of living people provided flesh and blood models as living artifacts with a real direct linkage to previous civilizations. These were historical and archaeological bodies, yet they were also animate, sentient, living bodies, offering multiple possibilities for the future, even as they provided resonances with the past. Thus, the authentic body took center stage, charged with recreating, re-embodying, and restaging the past. So, I'm claiming that yes, Purépechas are functioning as surrogates for the indigenous dead in the way that mestizos are touring the Days of the Dead in Michoacán. So they stand in for their dead ancestors before the tourist gaze. Their dark skin, features, and traditional clothing are read as live representations of the remnants of the pre-colonial past. And here is a graph that I created to help you visualize the way that that mestizo tourists were understanding indigeneity and what it meant to have an encounter with authentic Purépechacidad for mestizo tourists. This was according to whether or not the people that they visited were wearing traditional clothing. That was one factor that they were taking into account. What their houses looked like, and if their houses were made out of wood, because wood was the way that traditional Purépecha houses were made. Whether their houses had appliances or not was another factor that they took into account in considering if they were having an authentic experience with Purépechacidad. If the house that they visited or the community that they visited was impoverished, whether people were speaking the Purépecha language, and if people were still living a communal way of life. So these factors were producing indigeneity for mestizo tourists, and this is how they felt how they gauged whether or not they were getting an authentic experience in Michoacán. So here is an example from the field with my informant Monica, who was from Puerto Vallarta, a mestiza tourist. She speaks about a tumor that she had before she undertook this journey. For me, the tumor represented dying, killing all the negative things in my life, and being reborn to a new life. My recovery coincided with the metaphor of death. Since I had a close encounter with death, I wanted to come to Michoacán for spiritual renewal and to see how the ancient Mexicans deal with death. It's important to note that Monica told me that she was an attorney. She was pretty well off. She had just come back from a trip that she took to India, and was kind of going on this journey to try to understand death to these different places, and felt like she had to come to Michoacán to understand the way that Mexicans, herself being Mexican specifically, pre-colonial Mexicans understood death. So we can see here how some of that, those measures of authenticity are taking place with her experience. Another example from the field from Armando, who was from a journalist from Distrito Federal. I hope the simplicity will continue to be preserved for the best of these communities. So much progress is not good. Before, we used to think that progress was good and desirable, but in reality, that is not true. In reality, the humble conditions they live in are better. I hope that they keep it that way. So I claim that, these tourists are lost in feelings of Mestiz Melancholia. They both measure how progress or Western influences change indigenous communities. They didn't reflect upon the possibility of Purépechas having personal autonomy to participate in the capitalist economy or to buy non-indigenous things for their homes. They view poverty as an authentic Purépecha condition that shouldn't change in order to preserve Purépecha legitimacy. Another finding that I had from the field was that mestizos were also interested in acting as intermediaries between Purépechas and foreign tourists. So they claimed that they felt a sense of solidarity in addressing the destruction that was happening in these communities. For example, the trampling of graves, the pollution of the lake. To access the cemetery in this island, you have to cross a lake, the Pátzcuaro Lake. And felt like that was the fault of the foreigners who were coming in, and that they felt a sense of solidarity being fellow Mexicans with the indigenous people. They see themselves as respectful cultural brokers and are intermediaries between Purépechas and foreign tourists, and as participants in a traditional Mexican event that belongs to all Mexicans. I literally asked as part of my survey, does this event belong to Purépechas or does it belong to all Mexicans? And all of my mestizo informants said that the event belonged to all Mexicans. If Mexicanidad is a common thread woven through the Days of the Dead and indigenous-specific celebrations, then these events belong to all Mexicans. Mestizo tourists fail to see the participation in Purépecha events as acts of appropriation. Mestizos consider themselves invited guests to even the most private aspects of the ceremonies because they share the common heritage of being Mexicans with Purépechas. The majority of them express feeling this way about owning Purépecha cultural items as well. An example from the field with Armando. Yesterday there was a woman with her shawl, completely indigenous. She extended her petate, which is a reed mat, to hold vigil throughout the night over her departed relative. She was the only family member present. She was fixing her candles and all that. She was the ideal model for any photographer, including me. From the distance, with respect, I zoomed in and took a picture of her. But I noticed a lot of foreign people, surely more than one, who got way too close to her to take a picture. They stepped all over her relative's tomb. That told me a lot. That told me that it was a nuisance to Purépechas, a major disrespect to this woman's privacy in that moment with her dead one. I did it from far away with lots of respect and using the zoom. The other ones did not. And even without knowing her, the instance told me that foreign tourism is a problem. Those are valid feelings for Armando to have, but they're also problematic because it's not up to mestizos to be the heroic interventionist between indigenous people and foreign tourists. There is a lack of acknowledgement there that Purépechas also should and have a voice in articulating a critique of tourism. So I claim that there is a problem with this role that mestizo tourists take as intermediaries in critiquing and the fact that they kind of shift the blame to foreign tourism. Because the romanticization of Purépecha communities as needing intervention denies Purépechas the decision-making power of negotiating tourism on their own terms. It pits Purépechas as victims rather than as players with a stake in the tourist industry, and it allows mestizo tourists to not recognize their participation in the pollution of the lake, the desecration of the yacatas, and our cemetery, or the trashing of the islands, painting them as innocent bystanders. So once again, playing into that role of Mestiz Melancholia. You know, I forgot to check, did I have to turn anything on here, or is it on, or?
Oh, it might not, it's a flip a little bit.
Oh.
Does anyone even want to hear her?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, got it. So, I'm gonna move on to the second part of my findings here, which is how were Purépechas experiencing tourism? What did they think of their encounters with mestizo tourists? While Purépechas are complicit in tourism, they are keenly aware that they function as a spectacle during the Days of the Dead, and that tourists view them as different or less than. Purépechas understand that the state, the local government, and local companies appropriate their cultural symbolisms to attract tourists during the Days of the Dead. Purépechas see their communities as cohesive, morally superior, and rich, and they see mestizos as lost people. I explored whether Purépechas use what Alexis Bunton calls the commodified persona, which is a way for indigenous people to have agency in these types of interactions. And I found that, yes, they did use the commodified persona, meaning a persona that is presented specifically as a performance to tourists, that is separate from who they feel they are as people. And Purépechas used this commodified persona under 3 conditions. When they understood that this was a staging that was temporary, and that they were going to make a profit out of this staging. Here's an example of the commodified persona from the field. Nana Ofelia, one of my Purépecha women vendor informants from the community of Iguazio. They always ask questions like, why do we do these things? How long have we been doing them? Where did these traditions come from? I tell them it is because this is Sarpindecua, which is the Purépecha word for tradition. They ask who made the yacatas. I tell them I don't know. They ask me if I come from the same people who make the yacatas. I tell them probably because this is the only place I've always been from. These questions are ignorant. Of course I know who made the yacatas, and of course I come from the people who made the yacatas. I know a lot of stories about the yacatas that I don't share with tourists because they will probably go tell different information. My grandparents used to tell me that in the past the yacatas were a bad place and that you can still hear the spirits at night if you go there when it's dark. Since I can remember when I was little, kids have always been curious about the yacatas. And we used to sleep on top of the yacatas at night sometimes to try to hear the spirits, and we could hear very beautiful sounds. Here, Nana Ofelia shares with me something that she does not share with tourists. And I asked her, why don't you tell these stories about the yacatas to tourists? And she said, because they're gonna think that I'm crazy. Why are they gonna think that you're crazy? Because they don't have the Purépecha cosmovision to understand or access, my relationship to the yacatas. So, there is a commodified persona that she's presenting there in terms of, oh, I don't really know, that much about them. I don't know why they're there. I don't know if I'm related to those people. But then she tells me, well, I used to sleep on top of them when I was a kid, They're right there in Iguazio. So she says we used to go before it became a fenced-in archaeological site, and we used to, just sleep on them, and we could hear things at night, and then we would ask our parents, and they would tell us, that maybe they were bad spirits, and they would tell us different stories. But she claims that she's not willing to have tourists access these stories because it's not who they want to see. It's not the vendor that they want them to sell, that they want to buy from. The vendor they want to buy from is somebody who's just gonna present them with a price and negotiate the price or whatever, but not necessarily somebody who they're going to really understand as who she really is in her community. I also found that Purépechas have important critiques of mestizo, what they called, egocentrism and their imposition in these communities. This is Tata Pedro, who is from the community of San Lorenzo, and he's a very important Purépecha cultural activist and a journalist. For me, tourists, and especially mestizos, come here because they heard of us, or they simply heard of Indians in some previous situation, and they then want to experience us or observe us for themselves in person. They may have heard of our houses or how we dress or how we build altars, and then they may want to see if indigenous people do still exist and if we still do things the way our ancestors did or if we live in poverty. But they don't want to see us, to understand us, or to celebrate who we are as human beings. They come into our houses to see how different they are from us. I think in their minds, they keep count of these differences to say, poor people, they are not like me, or even, wow, we are better than them. The desire to visit can begin as curiosity, but in the end it is to confirm their superiority. And I found this to be a pattern when I asked, Purepecha informants to discuss how they felt about mestizos coming into their homes. And I think that it has to do, these attitudes have to do with how my Purepecha informants are experiencing mestiza racism on a daily basis in Michoacán. How, they feel like they get cast off in different settings, made fun of for speaking their language or wearing clothing, and those experiences with mestizo racism are informing, also why they think that mestizos are visiting them. So they're feeling like they're really coming here because this is really how they feel about us. I know because that's the way they treat me. They're coming here so that they can gather information on how much better they are and walk away with that information feeling better about themselves. Purépechas also feared being relegated to the past, being invisible, or only being appreciated for their dead ancestors, which I mentioned earlier is precisely what mestizo tourists are doing to them from the data that I gathered. This is also Tata Pedro. Days ago, I was reading about a general from the US who said, the best Indian is the dead Indian. That mentality applies here too. Dead Indians bring tourism, but alive they're a problem because they live and expect basic services for the community. To make good use of the culture and of the symbolisms, we would have to change the politics and the mindset of the tourist industry. Our symbolism should not only be used for their benefit, but it should also be a collective benefit that includes us and our needs. So he's referring to Philip Sheridan, right, who said that about American Indians here, and relating to that as he analyzes the conditions of tourism in Michoacán and the fact that he thinks, for the government and also for tourists and for the tourist industry, what are useful is to think about these dead Indians, these bodies that are buried, but the living Indians become an inconvenience because they need, services and they have a political agenda that nobody is listening to. When I asked my mestizo tourists, what do you know about current Purepecha concerns, Purepecha political priorities, they were, kind of like they have, concerns or they have, things that they're working on. Just not really informed about that, and we're just touring, for the purpose of experiencing the Days of the Dead, but didn't really understand, Purépechas as contemporary beings. So living Purépechas are viewed as part of the landscape and essential commodified authentication of this desired touristic experience. Another finding that I had from the field is that rather than internalizing mestizo attitudes, Purépechas draw strict differences between themselves as a group of people and mestizos. And these differences not only set Purépechas apart from Mexican society, but also make Purépechas ethically and culturally healthier people. So there's this term called ampacati, and I'll get into it a little bit more, but it basically means quality. And it applies to Purépechas in the way that they see themselves in the world as being quality people. And so having the characteristic of ampacati and it being applied to the cultural group, is a way that they draw differences between themselves and everybody else that they encounter pretty much, but specifically mestizos because they see mestizos as being orphaned, which I'll go into as well. Purépechas believe mestizos are culturally and spiritual lost people who come to Michoacán to learn about themselves and their past. Despite their visits, mestizos remain culturally astray because they return to their daily lives in the cities and continue to live by westernized cultural norms. So what does it mean to be ampacati? Purépechas descend from a long history of territorial protection. They have the retention of what can be identified as a distinct traditional Purépecha culture that differentiates them from mestizos. And they also pointed to the fact that they are interculturally competent and can move between these worlds and negotiate the mestizo world with the Purepecha world. And that this intercultural competence is not assimilation, but a means for economic survival, because code switching between those worlds is necessary to navigate the Purepecha world and the mestizo world. And it's also expected that if you do learn to code switch, you're still going to retain a sense of who you are as a Purepecha, because you are Ambacati, you're part of these quality people who have a long history of resistance and a long history of maintaining their language and traditions. Here's an example from the field from Nana Magdalena, who was from Chiran. I've always taught my children that we come from the warriors. We built the Yacatas and we won several battles against the Aztecs. We were the only people in Mexico who were not invaded by the Aztecs. These are things to be proud of. We should also be proud of the Purepecha communities like Santa Fe de las Lagunas and Chiran, who have fought hard to defend their territory. These things mean that Purepechas or Ambacati are people of high quality amongst Mexicans. We are not just any people, we are strong, quality people. Purepechas also saw mestizos as orphans, as eternal orphans that were, coming to experience the days of the dead or indigenous spirituality in general to try to make sense of this orphanhood. So here is a quote from Tata Anselmo, who was a medicine man from Calzoncin. Mestizos, the way I see them, is like this. They are 50% indigenous and 50% foreigner. However, the indigenous side is always stronger because it is here in Mexico, and that is why many turn to wanting to learn about the indigenous side. Mestizos are always lost between the two sides. They suffer trying to find their spiritual home beyond Catholicism. Those that want to understand the elements, to understand how we live on earth, how to pray to creation, they struggle, but they come to us as medicine people because we are here. They can go to Spain to try to learn about how to have the Spanish understand nature or the earth or their creator. After all, Mexico is where their roots are, not in Spain. So they come to us, to people like me. They don't know what to say, they don't know how to participate, what to sing or how to pray. Poor them, poor mestizaje, poor mestizos, but they try. And this was interesting to me because when I asked Tata Anselmo if he felt like he was less than mestizos or if he felt like he had experienced mestizo racism on a personal level, he said no. He said, and I asked him why, and he said, because I have more power than mestizos do. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, you have to understand that the way that mestizos come to me is that they want to participate in ceremonies. And I can tell them no and turn them away. And I have this power and this privilege to do that. I tell them sometimes these ceremonies are only for Purepechas. And so I say no and I turn them away. And, and then they get sad and then that's the end of that, Or he says, or I can negotiate with them, just like he considers also himself a doctor who can, also charge fees for certain practices. And so he says, I can negotiate with them to participate in certain, things for a price. So he says, so I don't feel like, I'm discriminated against. He says, I'm the one who does the discriminating. I also found that there definitely was Purepecha resistance to tourism. One way is that Purepechas sell cheap costume and or constructed cultural goods to mestizo tourists, and to all tourists in general, but it usually is mestizos who want to buy, for example, the clothing. And one example that I can tell you about is wanengos, that's the way that we call the embroidered blouses, the embroidered women's indigenous blouses in Michoacán. When I asked the female vendors who embroidered wanengos, how do you feel about selling wanengos to mestizas and them wearing them? They told me, well, it's just something that we make just to sell to them. I would never wear that. Something that I wear for myself, that I make for my daughter or that I make for myself is going to take me 2 months to embroider because I'm going to take great pride in it and I want everybody to see it during a community festival or during a ceremony. So they'll probably they'll make fun of me if they see me in one of the wanengos that takes me 1 week to make. That I produce to sell specifically to mestizas, and then they said things like, and then they come around here, they come back wearing it the next day, to our vendor spot, and we kind of laugh about it, because we just think that, that we know that we're just selling it to them as something that's not, that we can produce fast and not necessarily something that's quality or authentic. Another means of resistance Purepecha stage dances, which are social and are not spiritual in nature for tourists. During the Days of the Dead, I found that pretty much everything is staged and or commissioned. So how many of you have ever seen La Danza de los Viejitos be performed? It's kind of Michoacán's, exportation to the world of Purepecha Ciudad. This is a picture up there of the way that it's typically performed. It's typically performed in these types of clothes with a gaban or what people know as ponchos, and with a hat with ribbons and a mask that emulates Spanish features to make a mockery out of Spanish features. That's the way that the dance has evolved over time, and that's the way that it's performed for tourists. But I had the opportunity and I asked permission to be able to share this with people to see the way that the dance is being curated in closed ceremonies that are only for Purépechas, and I'm going to show you the difference. So, as you can see, the way that the dance is curated is very different. In this one, the way that they design their regalia is more to emulate the way that Purépechas used to look and dress before colonialism. The masks that they're wearing are meant to emulate spirits. They're not, they have nothing to do anymore with the Spaniards, like the way that you see in the picture there. And the music, even though I've been told that, if you ever watch La Danza de los Viejitos, the way that it's performed for tourists, it's performed with strings, it's performed with guitars and violins. And I've been told that the patterns of the music are pretty much the same, and the percussion is provided by the feet of the dancers. But in this other way that it's being reclaimed, it is done with a flute and a drum, which is how Purépecha music used to sound and be before the conquest. Where was the Purépecha hidden transcript? Well, I found that intimate family proclamation sessions are held in private homes or at the cemetery before tourists arrive, or as away from tourists as possible. During these proclamation sessions, usually the oldest matriarch in the family is in charge of leading them, and it's a way for Purépechas to commune with their dead. That's away from the tourist eye. So what happens during these proclamation sessions is that the oldest matriarch begins to announce everybody who's arriving to them, and telling the departed one, such and such is arriving. And it's a way to, I look at it as another form of surrogacy, because the departed one, the spirit of the departed one, or the grave of the departed one, becomes a substitution for what's missing in the family. A way to express, not just the longing for the person who has left, but also every single way that the family is messing up. So they announce, here comes Marcelina. She is never on time. She is just not doing good with her kids. They're getting bad grades in school. Please tell them something. Why did you leave me? They talk to the dead one. why did you leave me with all this responsibility? You were supposed to help me raise, Marcelina and have her be, better than what she's doing now, but look at all the ways that, that she's not doing well. Or here comes your son, the one who's always drinking, you're not here anymore to help me with that. You're not here to show him the way that he's supposed to act as a man. Those types of situations where, where these proclamations, these reclamos, that are happening with these family members are being told like updates to the person who left, and also mourning, the fact that they're not around to help shape people up. So those are sessions that I didn't really see being performed before tourists. They were sessions that happened in private homes or that happened at the grave site when tourists weren't around. Other ceremonies such as sweat lodges and peyote meetings and the Kurikaveri Quinchecua, or the Purepecha New Year, which happens in February, are closed or at least advertised as being closed to the public, conducted in the Purepecha language, and or are practiced in isolated villages at night or in the mountains. And my partner and I were definitely invited to some of these, and I did see that there's a different level of communion there between Purepechas that happens that is not present during the Days of the Dead. There's also, of course, ongoing Purepecha practices of political autonomy and acts of nationhood and resistance that are not necessarily as visible to the public. So for example, the community of Cherán, it was one of the first communities in Mexico to organize an autodefensa against the drug cartels, armed resistance, because their community forest was being illegally logged by narco traffickers. And they were some of the first. It was actually Purepecha women who arose and and started organizing community patrols to keep the narcos out, to stop the deforestation that was happening in their community. And that's not necessarily something that the public would know about, but it is a way that these practices of autonomy are also away from the public eye. So I want to move on to tell you a little bit about my future research and the way that my research is evolving now. One of the things that I encountered as I came back from the field was grappling with how I negotiated my identity in the field, not just as an indigenous woman, but also being mestiza, because my mom is from a mestiza community. But I was being read as a Purepecha due to my roots in specific communities. And so I had access to spaces that I otherwise wouldn't have had access to. And so I want to develop a concept, a model for understanding how indigenous subjectivity can be negotiated in the field. And here my work is influenced by Linda Tuhigawi-Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies, where she claims that we have to make research useful to the decolonization process in indigenous communities, and Eva Garut's concept of radical indigenism, where she reincorporates indigenous epistemologies into the academy and claims them to be just as valid as Western epistemologies. And Gerald Tayake Alfred's work around warrior scholarship, where he claims that we don't necessarily have to assimilate into the academy to be indigenous scholars, and that we can resist and create our own models. And so this is what I'm doing here. I'm developing a model on what it means to be an indigenous scholar in the field, or an insider informant. And I claim that we have what is termed multiplex subject position, and that this multiplex subject position is both a position with incredible insight, because we have access to spaces, like I said, that non-indigenous scholars wouldn't have access to. But there's also incredible privilege there, because we have, the freedom to travel, we have access to institutional sponsorship, we have the power to transcribe, to translate, to write, to publish these findings. And it's important to think about that privilege I use the concept of walking together, which comes from Caminando Juntos, which comes from the EZL and Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, that we need to use tremendous discretion, that we have the discretionary authority to share what should be shared and what shouldn't be shared. And it's something that was told to me, for example, as I went into one of the ceremonies. They said, we want you to participate, but remember, you're gonna know what to share and what needs to stay here. And that is something that I think is important when thinking about how Indigenous subjectivity is negotiated in the field. And it's right that we should have and that we shouldn't apologize for. I also believe that Indigenous scholars can have what I call an Indigenous political approach, meaning that they can embrace decolonial politics and not be apologetic about that as we consider how we analyze our findings and publish our findings. And this model is also going to be an opportunity for non-Indigenous scholars to understand how to work with communities in an empowering way that contributes to decolonizing rather to recolonizing. So here are the tenets of Mimichekwa y Kukinari. And Mimichekwa in the Purepecha language, it means knowledge, and that can both encompass traditional knowledge that is learned, through oral tradition or being passed down, and it can also encompass learned knowledge. And Kukinari in our language means like being rebellious or being unconquerable, and it was the closest term that I could find to decolonization. So, like decolonizing knowledge or rebellious knowledge or unconquerable knowledge. The tenets of Mimichekwa y Kukinari that are surrounding their Indigenous subjectivity in the middle are competency, empowerment, decolonization, and reciprocity. What do I mean by competency? I mean that Indigenous scholars shouldn't just assume that they have competency as they approach work with Indigenous communities, that we also need to make sure that we're competent. For example, somebody like me who genealogically belongs to this group, but have been away as a migrant from my home communities, that I went through the Indigenous IRB process. And we think about the IRB as being institutional, but I'm claiming that there's also an Indigenous IRB process that is native to the field that you can undertake, whether that's by going through typical measures like like if there's a tribal council, or going through your own measures like writing a proposal and bringing it to people who are authorities in the field who can give you feedback and approve or inform your research. Secondly, I propose that competency can be achieved by forming your own community dissertation committee, which is something that I did. So I had my dissertation committee through UC Berkeley. And then I also had, 3 people that consistently influenced and shaped and gave me feedback on my work, a cultural worker, a medicine person, and a community activist who was based out of Washington State here. And I met with them regularly, via Skype or by phone calls or whatnot, to keep myself accountable as I was in every stage of the research process and have them inform the way that my work was being shaped. The reason why I think that's important is because, I believe that the research that is gathered from Indigenous communities should never, should not compromise the community's autonomy, and this is where the tenet of decolonization comes in. Decolonization for me means that the community's autonomy is at the center of the work, and that Indigenous knowledge is produced through the work, and that those epistemologies and that knowledge is valued just as much as Western knowledge would be valued. And empowerment, another tenet, which I believe can be achieved through making sure that the recovery process, the preservation, whether that's cultural preservation, linguistic preservation, etc., is incorporated into every aspect of the research. That starts with methodology. The methodology, whether it's archival or whether it's ethnographic, should always be informed by the self-determination of the community, and that's something that should also not be compromised for the community's empowerment. And finally, the tenet of reciprocity, which I think can be achieved through partnerships and making sure that the work is accessible. So that means meaningful partnerships. It means following through with partnerships that arise from the field work. It could be partnerships with community organizations, partnerships with specific families or people that have been developed, and also that the work is accessible by being translated into that particular language or being translated into a language that people can access. Like for example, Spanish in my case for some of my informants, and that it's available in at local institutions. Community institutions, not just at libraries. So for example, at a community center. Research that is coming up for me. I'm working on a project that I started working on in 2009. It's, I call it India como la Virgen, embodied indigeneity at Guadalupe Patron Saint Fiestas. I started this work in my mother's community, which is a mestiza community, like I told you before, a more mixed community. It's called Atapaneo. And this work queries whether mestizas who wear indigenous clothing for Guadalupe worship engage in racial mimicry, and if such acts are motivated by the fetishization of Guadalupe. So it's important for me to think about fetish theory, and I look towards Anne McClintock's work in Imperial Leather, where she theorizes that a fetish arises under 4 conditions. The first one is that there's a social contradiction that is being resolved. And for me, that social contradiction that we have in Mexico is mestizaje, and how, you know, we're continuously grappling with mestizo identity, as I mentioned before, being burdened from this incredible violence of rape. That there is a displacement, a passion that is displaced directly onto an object or a person, and for me that object or person is religious iconography, and in this case La Virgen de Guadalupe. That there is repetitious recurrence within historical memory of that particular object or thing, and we can definitely say that that's the case with La Virgen, and that intense passion is placed upon this fetish. I think that thinking about La Virgen and, you know, Catholic religious iconography as a fetish is helpful, and this quote informs that by Anne McClintock. By displacing power onto the fetish, then manipulating the fetish, the individual gains symbolic control over what might otherwise be terrifying ambiguities. So I believe that mestizos are dealing with their terrifying ambiguities by looking towards La Virgen as a what I call a curandera of historical trauma, a healer of the historical trauma that we encountered, in doing so through acts of appropriation, like you know, like borrowing indigenous clothing specific for that day. So I wish to explore how these performances, what these performances reveal about the racialization of mestizos as orphan bastards, the romanticization of indigenous identities as pure and innocent, and thereby closer to God, and the fetishization of Guadalupe as Mexico's curandera of historical trauma. And finally, I'm also working on another project which involves analyzing representations of La India Maria in both Mexico and the United States, and how representations of La India Maria inform our understandings of Mexican indigeneity, specifically gendered Mexican indigeneity, because if you ever travel to Mexico, you will notice that it's usually indigenous women that are wearing traditional clothing, for example, in the marketplaces. And she represents that in a way, because if you ever watch her movies, it's noticeable that she's usually in her traditional clothing in these public spaces, sometimes selling, you know, fruit or whatnot. She's manhandled by the police, you know, they chase her, they push her around, she ends up in jail, etc. She's portrayed in her long skirts and braids and embroidered shawls, blouses, and is representing, you know, these portrayals of poverty, of clumsiness, of ignorance, of being unintelligible, speaking in an unintelligible language, and invisibility. So I want to ask, how do these performances of Mexican actress Maria Elena Velasco, who actually passed away a couple years ago, as La India Maria, impact Mexican and Chicano understandings of race and gendered indigeneity in Mexico and in the United States? And I want to do this by working with indigenous people and the way that they feel, you know, these portrayals are informing understandings about indigeneity, as well as working with Latinos and Chicanos in the U.S. And analyzing the consumption of these images through specifically Univision, where her image, you know, has been imported into the U.S. And I believe that this work is important. These different lines of my work are important because we are seeing more and more indigenous migration from Latin America, and we are seeing more and more of an interest and an investment in exploring Afro-Latinidades. And I think we need to start talking about race amongst Latinos, the way that, you know, that mestizaje reproduces, you know, power relations and how that can be problematic for Afro-Latinos and for indigenous people in Latin America. Thank you. Questions?
We have time for questions. I can ask.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm just scrolling through my notes here. One question I had came up when you were giving us the segment of the interview about the Yacatas, and she was talking about, when I was a kid, we would go and lay down and we'd listen.
Mhm.
And then you mentioned that those spaces had been cordoned off for
Yeah.
archaeologists. And so, what, if anything, did people say about the archaeologists who are trying to produce knowledge out of this space compared to the mestizos who are coming to visit and gain some sort of knowledge?
Mhm.
What did they think about that, those processes of blocking off the spaces for knowledge
Yeah.
production?
There's a lot of negotiation there, and monetary negotiation. So for example, these yacatas that Nano Felia was talking about are in her community of Iguazio. And so they wanted to have input in how the space was gonna be curated, and they wanted to ensure that they were able to access the space whenever they, wanted to. So there was definitely, negotiations there with the Mexican, National Institute of Archaeology, and making sure that the community has some impact. When I went to visit the Yacatas, for example, the community itself was helping, clean up the road. And when I asked them, why they were doing that so that people could access the Yacatas, they said because it was bringing revenue into the community, and they did want to share, the Yacatas. They're proud of them, as it's a very physical symbol to them of their greatness, of who they are. And so there's definitely some negotiation there, although it's not the same. And this also has to do with the fact that roads were built into the community to give people access. So they do talk about, for example, how before the roads were built, things were very different. And some people say we didn't even know that mestizos existed. We thought it was just purépechas, we just lived with each other. And the people who knew that they existed were the ones who went out and sold things or whatnot. But it was more of like an isolated type of community. And in terms of what they thought about the archaeologists, I didn't really ask that much about that, and they didn't really, share that much about that. But I can tell you what they thought of me, being a scholar in the field. And I think that what they thought is that I had tremendous privilege to be able to be, asking these questions and gathering this knowledge, and that they hoped that I was going to use this privilege in a way that was going to be, was going to be good, rather than continuing to paint these portrayals that are problematic for them. Yeah.
Yes. First of all, thank you. Great presentation. I can't wait to read your future work.
Thank you.
So I guess I have two questions. So one of them is, and maybe you talked a little bit about it before I came in, but so you talk a lot about mestizaje and mestizos. So I'm wondering, but I didn't really see you use a lot like Chicano scholars understanding of mestizaje. So
Sure.
I'm wondering, how are you viewing mestizaje in terms of maybe how it's understood here in the U.S. by Chicanos as opposed to Mexico? And so how are you working through that? And also in understanding or these responses to the Day of the Dead, if there was any particular kind of difference between what we would consider Chicano mestizaje and Mexican mestizaje, or the perceptions of these different mestizajes.
Yeah, definitely. So I first, also another work that inspired me to pursue the question of mestizaje was Gloria Zaldua's Borderlands, which I read during my sophomore year, I think, at Stanford. And it was interesting to me because, coming from Charo, Michoacán is where my paternal community is. And the attitudes towards mestizos, I grew up with not necessarily all positive attitudes about mestizos in my Matlatzinca home community. And so when I kind of read the way that Gloria Anzaldúa was reclaiming mestizaje and using it as a way to theorize about hybridity, that was really empowering to me because I now had a hybrid experience, I couldn't say that I was the same, like the same person who stayed, in my home community. I mean, I would have loved to have that, to have grown up there or whatnot. But as I became an immigrant in the United States, I became somebody who spoke, different languages, somebody who crossed the border literally, somebody who was negotiating adopting a Chicana identity even though I was an immigrant. And so for me it was very empowering to see Gloria Anzaldúa theorize about mestizajes as being on the borderlands, as being about hybridity, as being something that could be empowering. But at the same time I asked questions about the reification of indigenous symbolisms in her work. And and how for me in Chicano scholarship it's continuously happened, especially with the Mexicas, and why, for example, like for me it was kind of like, well, she's using like for example Coatlicue and Tonantzin and Coyoxauhqui in this book. Like why didn't she look at Nana Cuerachperi, like the way that we think of her in our ways, or at other nations? So it was kind of replicating. And I also remind you that we didn't have the best relationship with the Aztecs, so there were also attitudes about Mexicas in my home communities. And so so it was like kind of like, is this replicating in Chicano studies? Are we replicating like Aztec empire expansion? How does that relate to me as a woman who has Purépecha roots? And how can I critique Anzaldúa from this very loving place to push the work a little bit further, to think about the way that mestizaje is also reproducing a monolithic Latino identity that I don't think we can claim we have anymore. I think that we are definitely diverse. Like I said, I think that we need to talk about race. I think that mestizaje is extremely useful as a theoretical concept. It's extremely useful just as living theory, the way that Chicana feminists call it. But I also definitely want to push us a little bit more. And how Chicanos relate to the Days of the Dead, I think is incredibly different than the way that my mestizo informants in Mexico were relating to the Days of the Dead. Because here it's a means of resistance. It's a means of having visibility. Because Chicanos here also live under what I would call colonial conditions as well. And so this is like one of the most visible, and it's unfortunate that it's getting so appropriated by the mainstream now, but it's a way for us to have visibility. I love seeing the altares on college campuses, and the fact that there's Mexicans on those altares, and that I can say, we're remembering our dead, especially on predominantly white campuses. I think that those representations, those political protests are necessary to think about, even now that Mexico's involved in pretty much a civil war, So yeah, I think that here in the States we relate to the Days of the Dead very differently than, in Mexico, where one of the questions that my informants had was, in Mexico, people have access to Days of the Dead celebrations in their home. Like, why don't they just stay home and like commune with their own dead, and do their practices that way? Like, why is there an insistence in coming and seeing the way that we do things, specifically? And that's where those questions get a little bit trickier in terms of appropriation and commodification. Does that address your questions?
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah.
You brought up Linda Maria, and she's someone your research is focusing on right now. And I was thinking about this kind of like minstrelsy, right, that we're seeing here. And in a previous slide, you mentioned that a lot of mestizos use La Virgen de Guadalupe as a way to also enter some kind of indigenous identity. So to me, it seems like Guadalupe, or that image of La Virgen, is also acting as some kind of Catholic minstrelsy of indigenous people. And this is a connection that I'm seeing between, La India Maria, the Virgin, La Virgen Guadalupe is such a Catholic European depiction of indigenous people. So are you also making these connections about, entering through some, like a European symbol?
I wouldn't consider La Virgen a European symbol. The way that I look at at La Virgen is through, she's an image of religious syncretism, or maybe syncretism isn't even the correct word, but at least for my people, we're very Virgen centric, and it's because it's a way for us to also honor Nana Cuerachped, who is, our mother Earth. So I don't know if I would necessarily claim that it's the same thing. I think that the minstrelsy in the Virgen case, the way that I'm examining, is happening with mestizos adopting the clothing, for the festivals, and kind of like playing Indian, for that particular day. And that's where my informants have a big problem with it, because my Purepecha informants have a big problem with it, because they say, they get to wear these clothes, for this day and look beautiful, and everybody celebrates it, and they can, participate in, it's a way for them to pray, it's a way for them to dance for La Virgen, but I get pushed around on a daily basis because I wear those clothes, and so it's a way for me to be racialized and to be seen as inferior, but on this one day it's acceptable for everybody to go native. So that's, I think that maybe that's where more of the minstrel act would be, rather than with the actual iconography. Yeah.
I think it was just a kind of semantic question, but it might get into some of the larger kind of theoretical issues people are raising. And it starts from at the start you talked about authenticity, and I understood it was largely a critique because of consumption. And so this criteria you came to, the critical criteria for subject positions, was autonomy. But I'm wondering if you kind of are deliberately, well, first of all, deliberately then not returning to authenticity, or to what extent authenticity is within the communities and the subject groups you're talking about, something that the communities are concerned about in terms of what identities do we want to present and represent, and which cultural practices are appropriate. And I'm even, in a very kind of, even more kind of private way, because it was, and so I'm kind of I was just thinking generally about authenticity and autonomy, but then it seems like it kind of feeds into something.
Yeah, no, I think you have an excellent point, and I can give you a couple of examples where that is playing out. One of the examples is in the way that the autodefensa in Cherán was organized. Because what they basically did is that they had an indigenous government that was recognized by local authorities, and that was recognized by the Michoacán state government as being, autonomous indigenous government. But they kicked out that indigenous government because they felt like it was, it was in line with the project of neocolonization. It was more in line with like assimilation. And what they did to recreate, a more authentic indigenous government is that they went to La Relación de Michoacán, which I mentioned earlier, and they saw the way that indigenous government was practiced according to La Relación de Michoacán, which is our pre-colonial, oral history. And they recreated indigenous governance according to the way that things were done there, and installed a new, elders council, a new indigenous government to run the way that things were being done in this community now as an autodefensa, as a self-defense type of community that was going to do its own patrolling and practice its own forms of government, and decided that form of government was not, that they didn't need recognition from local authorities, they didn't need recognition from the Michoacán state government. It was, now their own form of government that was going to be practiced as resistance, and blocked off the actual community so that nobody can really go in there. And for example, political parties can't even access the community, like during elections and things like that. So it was a different way to practice autonomy, and that question of authenticity, was resolved by going to an original document. So that's one example where there is a concern with authenticity as well within the hidden transcript. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk, Ms. Darling. I was struck at your repeated use of informant. And I wonder if you just kind of share how you see that term and how you position yourself And I'm curious how you would describe your contribution to, say, like American Indian Studies as a field or Indigenous Studies more broadly.
Sure. Well, I think that's where maybe I need to decolonize myself and not use the word informants. And I think it comes from my training as an anthropologist, because that's just the term, that I was trained to use. But, I mean, obviously these were, at least in terms of the Purepecha people that I work with, they're friends, and they're people that I've collaborated with over a number of years and that I'm continuing to collaborate with. So I guess I could consider them more like colleagues, for example. But that's where that term comes in terms of it being kind of very ethnographic, very field worky, type of term to talk about people who informed my research or who gave me information about the field that I then analyzed to produce findings. So that's where that my use of that term comes in. But like I said, maybe I do need to rethink it and come up with other ways to talk about the people that I worked with. My intervention in American Indian Studies, I think, comes in with thinking through Indigenous subjectivity in the field. I don't think that we've really have done enough thinking about that. At least I know that there's a lot of work that informed my work, as I mentioned, on decolonizing the academy, and that's informing our pedagogy, it's informing our teaching philosophies, it's informing what we're bringing into the classroom. But in terms of how do we actually go and do research, and what do we do with the research that we gather? And that's where I think I'm coming in and saying we need to talk about the research being empowering and not compromising the autonomy. What are ways that we can do that? And that's where I come in to talk about, for example, competency. And another I think intervention that I'm making in Indigenous studies is in thinking about tourism as settler colonialism. I think that tourism can definitely, be considered a form of settler colonialism in our communities, and pushing us to think about, how complicit we are with it. If there are other ways, to, for example, sustain ourselves. The question of sustainability there is important, and it's a critique and it's a concern that the Purepechas I work with, that they that they continuously brought up in terms of accessing decision-making power in the tourist industry, and critiquing it and calling it by what it is, which is why is there a need for Purepechas to allow so many people to flood these sacred places like the cemetery to survive, and I think that's important to when we think about Indigenous studies. And another intervention that I'm making is in the subset of what's called heritage tourism studies, and thinking about how mixed race people tour. And here in the United States, a great percentage of the American Indian population is also mixed race. And I think that it's important to consider as part of mixed race, critical mixed race studies, because I don't think that there's enough thinking around that. There's definitely scholarship around, for example, the issue of blood quantum and disenrollment and whatnot, and what that means for communities. But if we did consider a subfield in American Indian Studies, critical mixed race studies, what would that do to the field? And how could we think then about power and privilege, for example, in the way that we propagate it, and how we relate to each other and how we relate to other Indigenous communities?
Other questions?
I have a question. In your interviews with Mestizos, did you mainly interview tourists, or did you do some interviews with people who live more locally?
I did.
And what were some of the differences between, because you mentioned a little bit about Purepechas experiences with mestizos in their more local communities versus their experiences with tourism, and I'm wondering, were these class differences, were they, I don't know if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I definitely did also talk to mestizo locals, especially people who own some of the businesses that were named, like, for example, businesses that were specifically named after Purepecha words. That was really interesting to me, and I wanted to ask them, like, why did you select that name, or, or why are you selling, things in here that were made by Purepechas if you're not a Purepecha, questions like that. And what I gathered was that they were also, cultural brokers, and there was an intermediary, also role that they were playing, and it wasn't one that was friendly to the indigenous population. It was one where they felt like, I like that that I can call my place of business in this Purepecha word because I know that it's going to attract, tourists and that I'm going to make money off of it, but I don't really like seeing them, here. I don't like when they come, to the plaza and like they all set up their own stands or whatever because it creates competition, but also because I just think that it would be better if they just stayed, kind of like on their island, and then the tourists could go there, but I could still sell, the things that I sell here in my shop. And also, in Pátzcuaro, where mestizos have lived with Purepechas for such a long time, there is, kind of previous ethnic relations and contested ethnic relations that I was coming into already in the field between mestizos and Purepechas locally that were fascinating as well to query. And what I found is that, they use, the mestizos in Pátzcuaro have a lot of different terms that are racial slurs, that they apply to indigenous people, and the fact that those terms are still used, like for example, for the women, one term that was common was Maria, and the reason for that is because they claim that that before all of them would get the same name, that they were called Maria, which is kind of like it's a referral to the Virgin Mary, and that they would all be called Maria something, So the fact that they're using this, kind of monolithic term to call all indigenous women the same name is extremely, in my opinion, it's extremely racist because it's a way to erase, the fact that these women all have, different names. And another term that they use for women is also ware, which is a Purepecha. It's actually a Purepecha term, and it does mean woman, but it means woman, a married woman. And what they don't know is that there are different terms for different types of women in the community. So that just means a married woman, but then there is a nanakeri, who's like a grandmother, and then there is a nanaka, who is like an unmarried woman. And so, like that's another way to kind of, make them monolithic, or to erase as well, which I think also stems from that racism present at the local level. And then of course there's more classic terms that were thrown around, like patarrajada, which means split foot, barefoot or split foot, which is a term that's commonly used in urban areas in Mexico to refer to indigenous people, and indito, which is like little Indian, and that is a way to infantilize, indigenous people as well. So that was more, those terms were definitely more prominent with the local people that I talked to.
Did you find that they were trying to access indigeneity in different ways or at all compared to?
Oh no, they wouldn't care about it. No, they didn't consider themselves, part of being indigenous. That they weren't interested in that at all. Like the people that I focused on for this, for this research, were trying to access indigeneity and through tours. But the locals that I interviewed, like the shop owners, they totally saw themselves as different and didn't really want anything to do with indigeneity. Really good questions.
I do have a question. I'm not sure what the question is, but what I'm thinking is, here we are in Minnesota, right, which was once the great lands of the Dakota Nation, Ojibwe. And in terms of the Native American term, which is a general term for many nations, I'm curious about how you view or where you see it going, the relation between Native Americans and Mexican indigenous, because as we know, Mexico, I want to say Mexico has the highest population of indigenous people in this hemisphere, one area. And I had traveled to Albuquerque and experienced the Pueblo nations there. And I met a Bolivian man who's an indigenous man who claims that the Native Americans learned about feathers from the Aztecs. And we know that a lot of Native American cultures, or some Native American cultures, speak also Nahuatl, as well as their original languages. And so I guess my question is, how do you see that relation and where it might be going? Because I
Well,
feel
maybe
like
I can
because of
tell you-
mestizaje, like we're not really seen as indigenous for people of Mexico,
Okay.
And I I understand that there's also a process of reclaiming, as we've been talking. And I remember learning about a Hopi prophecy, or a Hopi saying that says that if you're practicing and Mother Earth is welcoming, and you can reclaim your indigenous, you don't have to take to a nation. And so I think also as a lot of indigenous people are migrating from Mexico here to the US, the makeup of these relations is changing.
Well, maybe I can tell you a little bit about another way that I was able to access the field that I wouldn't have been able to do, and that was with my partner's presence in the field, because he is Ojibwe. He's from the Red Lake Nation here in Minnesota. And people, Purépechas, were extremely curious about my husband, Chester. They wanted to talk to him. They wanted him to participate. And, they said that visits from North American natives were extremely rare. And they wanted to ask him about, for example, what do you do when you're getting ready to run? Because my partner does spiritual Eagle Staff runs. And so, what are some practices that you do to cleanse yourself, when you're getting ready to run? Oh, he was talking about how he puts some cedar inside of his tennis shoes. Really, this is the way that we get ready, to climb, because there's like some mountain, hiking that happens, that is also spiritual in nature down there. So they wanted Chester there. And because they wanted Chester there, then that means I could go, right? So they were very curious, and I think that curiosity stemmed not only from the fact that indigeneity is much more Pan-American now than it was, maybe 20, 30 years ago, but also because when they first, for example, found out about Chester, and Chester, is enrolled, and he's a card carrier. I call him a card carrying Indian. When they saw that too, they were like, wow, you actually have a way to identify as indigenous, as officially recognized by the state. Like, I wish that we had, something like that would, that would allow us to claim some of the rights that we're trying to access here, like that would give us voice. But it was also because when I first introduced Chester to people, they said things, Purépechas said things like, I thought that you guys were all dead. I thought that the English had wiped you out. That's the stereotype of the disappearing Indian, right? That's also prevalent in Latin America, that, there are really indigenous people left up here or whatnot. They wanted to talk to him. And one of the partnerships that emerged from the field through the organization that my partner's involved with, it's called First Nations United, is a Purepecha Ojibwe cultural exchange. So there's Skype sessions and things that are happening with exchanging cultural products and whatnot, to be able to understand each other and keep that connection going between the two groups that emerged from bringing Chester down there with me. And there's a whole other element of gender there, and the whole perception of me, being married as well, because I wasn't married at the time, but there were only certain, I was only able to access certain spaces if I was married. So Chester also facilitated that, and not to mention all the violence with the drug war, and making just my parents feel better about having a man with me, unfortunately, to be able to do this field work and travel around different places, not just in Michoacán, but in Mexico, that also gave me access to the field. I just thought I would answer your question by giving you some of the perceptions of him being in the field with me and how that opened up conversations.
Thank you.
Great, I think we will thank you for.
Okay.